Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. My name is Giselle Newton. I'm a doctoral candidate at the Centre for Social Research in Health, Sydney. I'd just like to start by acknowledging the country that I'm on at the moment, the country of the Bidjigal people at UNSW Sydney. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any other Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here with us today. So feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where it is what country it is you're joining us from. We just ask that people turn off their video throughout the seminar today, so that people that have maybe limited internet can still join. This seminar is being audio and video recorded, so it will be also available after today to be listened to by a broader community. If you'd like to raise any questions in the chat, you're also welcome to, and there'll be time for questions at the end. Okay, so Dr. Andy Kaladelfos is a lecturer in Criminology and Deputy Postgraduate Coordinator in the School of Social Sciences at the University of New South Wales. And his research specialities are sexual and gender-based violence, queer criminology, immigration regulation, and homophobic and transphobic violence. And he is the co-author of Sex Crimes in the 50s and co-editor of The Sexual Abuse of Children, and leads the ARC Discovery Project, Australian Violence, Understanding Victimisation in History. And he is a proud transmasculine, non-binary and queer person who uses they, them pronouns. So please make them welcome. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Giselle, and hello, everybody. Thanks to Karen for the invitation, and also to Christy as well. I'm not sure if Christy's here. I haven't seen her name pop up yet. Can I just say it's so lovely to be able to see in the chat. Hello, Christy. So many people who I know from all over the country, and as awkward as these online seminars are in a way, and I've created for you the virtual environment, which is actually Deakin University behind me. I think one of the great outcomes is that we're able to share our research all around the country and internationally in that way. And I noted Kate was here, a colleague of mine all the way from Berlin. I'd also like to start by giving my acknowledgement of country as well. I'm speaking to you today from Gadigal land, from stolen land, from land where sovereignty was never ceded. I recognise the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the rightful owners and custodians of this land that I'm on, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I think it's really important to recognise too that for the topic that I am speaking about today, both violence against transgender people and also interactions with the criminal justice system, that Indigenous people in Australia and around the world continue to be disproportionately affected by this violence, and are criminalised and targeted by police and imprisoned in Australia at extraordinary rates, some of the highest rates in the world. So it's important for us to recognise those inequalities for our sister girls and brother boys, and that we stand with them in their struggles. I'd also like to give a content warning for the paper today, and I don't think it was immediately obvious from the title, so I normally give these content warnings when it's not, that the paper today does include discussions of violence that might be sexual, domestic or family violence against transgender people. It doesn't include any detailed case studies, but I do identify statistics and broader discussions. So I ask if listeners to please assess your capacity to listen to that content. And if you feel that you're unable to listen to it, simply take a break by turning your sound off or close your computer. So as Giselle indicated in the opening, my background is both history and criminology. And that's my approach to looking at this topic of transgender people, victimisation, and the criminal justice system, from both the perspectives of contemporary justice approaches, but also from the perspective that we can learn much about contemporary concerns by examining how these problems have been dealt with in the past. And I think particularly about how they've been dealt with in the past in the second half of the paper, where I focus on issues in relation to prisons and sex segregation. And so basically the paper is trying to map out what a research agenda might look like in criminology for trying to understand some of the issues related to transgender people, criminology, the criminal justice system, victimisation, etc. And there's two main concerns that I addressed in the first and second half of the paper. The first half of the paper looks at issues around reporting and collection of data on victimisation of transgender people, where despite mounting evidence of serious victimisation of transgender and gender diverse people, mostly from public health surveys, criminology as a discipline or practice itself has little engaged with capturing, measuring, preventing, or otherwise analysing that incidence of violence. And then the second half of the paper looks at debates over sex-segregated prison policy, which, as people might know, for the past few years have been the source of a very acrimonious debate between trans rights activists and self-proclaimed gender-critical feminists, labelled TERFs by trans rights activists. Many of those, I think it's important for us to think about this, as many of those are academics. Academics who believe that trans people pose security risks, specifically trans women in women's prisons. And this topic has been the source of a lot of debate in the UK and Canada, and has recently become the source of published research in criminology. So I think it's important that we start to think about the effects of these policies in this research. So even just comparing the two areas from the outset, although there's really mounting evidence of serious and disproportionate victimisation of transgender people, there's very little criminological commentary or specialist studies in that area. Whereas in the second area, prisons, there's really very limited evidence of safety risks in prisons posed by transgender people, but there's a lot of conjecture, and there's a growing commentary in criminology and specialist studies in that area. So I'll just share my screen here, give me a moment. Hopefully that's all good. So I'll begin with this, an incident on Monday that people might have read about in the newspaper to illustrate some of the difficulties around transgender people reporting incidents of violence to the police. So on the weekend, a senior constable from the Victorian Police Force took and circulated, just checking that's not a comment that no one can see my video. No, great. Took and circulated images of a former AFL coach and player, Dean Laidley. Laidley was arrested on stalking charges and was questioned in the station while dressed in women's clothing. These photographs, presumably sellable, not only because of that Laidley's profile and arrest, but because of the clothing that he was wearing, were then circulated and published on the front page of the Victorian Herald Sun on Monday, and subsequently republished in every single one of their stories about the officer's suspension and the players' responses to his arrest. Alongside other advocacy networks, the Victorian LGBTI Legal Service responded by labelling this incident transphobic, writing on social media that the leaking of these photos is an appalling breach of privacy, and such disregard speaks to the deep transphobia and misogyny that still exists in some elements of Victorian police. Our trans and gender diverse clients, they write, routinely report a lack of trust in Victorian police, and this incident serves to show why. This incident was much like those that was found in the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission report on homophobia and transphobia in the Victorian Police Force that was released just about a year ago, where it found that officers regularly joked about, belittled and bullied LGBTIQ people, including their own police colleagues, and that this was part of a hyper-masculine culture of the force. In August last year, the Chief Commissioner of Victorian Police, Graham Ashton, issued an apology to the LGBTIQ community for historic wrongs, saying that Victorian Police had caused unnecessary and unacceptable harm in the community. Excuse me. The Police Commissioner's apology came 3 years after the Victorian government's historical apology for the criminalisation of homosexual offences and the creation of an expungement scheme to remove the criminal records of those who were charged. And I'd also note here that those same laws affected trans people, mostly trans women, who were also charged with public order offences and other indecent offences. Those historical views of the police force are encapsulated by New South Wales Police Commissioner Colin Delaney's remarks from the 1950s, where he remarked that homosexuality was Australia's greatest menace, that homosexuality was a cancer in the community, a vice in our society. Beginning in the 1940s, police units ramped up the use of vice squads to target mostly homosexuals, with tactics that would often include entrapment, falsification of statements, blackmail, threats, and actual violence. These tactics continued as police policy until at least the 1980s, and police culture far longer, and many of the effects are documented here in the ACON report. And I note Michael was here. Thank you, Michael, for this report and for your ongoing work in pursuit of truth and justice, which is about historical gay and transgender hate crimes that were little investigated by police at the time. The effect of this police culture on LGBTIQ people's distrust in police is profound, and not just for those communities that were historically targeted. As William Leonard and Bianca, who I noted was here as well, Victorian studies showed it was young LGBTIQ people that reported the least trust in police. And many noted that they would not report their victimisation, be it domestic violence or public homophobic or transphobic violence, for fear of the police response. And that indeed is the same distrust in police reflected in the LGBTI Legal Services comments on Monday in relation to Laidley's arrest. So in responding to these ongoing cultures in police, one of the key findings of the Victorian Human Rights Commission report was that in Victorian Police's diversity training itself for police recruits, it included, up until 2018, the use of outdated and offensive terminologies in relation to transgender and intersex people. And despite recommendations in 2015, it hadn't been updated to inclusive language standards. In one module, it described a transgender person using the example of an offender in a case of serious violence, rather than highlighting the fact that transgender people are often the victims of violence. In fact, the report found that there is no evidence in these reference materials for diversity training to the common prejudice-motivated crimes that actually impact Victoria's LGBTI community. So that is no reference to hate crimes or victimisation of any LGBTIQ people. The report made a number of points for improvement, and the first is what I'm going to focus on now. It recommended to include material on the nature and extent of homophobic hate crimes and family violence for the LGBTI members of the Victorian community. And I've just highlighted for you here that they only say homophobic in this sentence, although they're referring to the whole LGBTIQ community. And that's an example of the T often being left out of these discussions, although it's mentioned in the acronym. So here I thought about what would happen if Victorian Police wanted to introduce material on the nature and extent of transphobic hate crimes and family violence in Victoria. Well, they would find that it is not a very straightforward task to find that information, and that there's significant structural, methodological, and research-related issues that really impede finding out the answer to that question in the first place. They would find it very hard to describe the nature and extent of transphobic family violence or hate crimes in Victoria, nor anywhere else in Australia, as that research is still in its infancy, as we have little comprehensive government reporting, few self-report victimisation studies, and no national third-party or community reporting services for those types of crimes. The situation in Australia in regard to prejudice motivated or hate crimes is not at all like that of the UK, where they have a victim-led system where one can report a hate crime to a third-party service. It's also not at all like the USA, where hate crimes are rolled into a national publicly accessible database. We have neither comprehensive victim reporting, nor do we have ready access to official data that is reported on hate crime. The issue of hate crime in our communities has been examined for the last 2 years by the New South Wales Legislative Council's inquiry into gay and transgender hate crimes that occurred between 1970 and 1910. And this is related in part to Michael's report, or the ACON report that I referred to earlier. I did a submission with some colleagues that are here as well in 2018, and we did a further submission this year with members of the Australian Hate Crime Network. Michael, Nicole Asquith, not sure if Nicole's here, Mahmoud Hawa, and a number of other colleagues. And in that submission, we highlight the various different challenges to recording and understanding hate crimes against the gay and transgender community, from policing issues of lack of trust in police, law reform issues of third-party reporting, victim support services, the potential for restorative justice provisions, and other restitution. And one of the things that we highlighted in the outset of that submission was drawing on Nicole Asquith's research into LGBTIQ family violence. We've said that one of the substantive challenges in estimating the extent of hate crimes is the crossover between the category of hate crime and family violence. From a policing perspective, hate crime is often seen as one being conducted as a type of crime conducted by an organised group or a particularly motivated offender. Indeed, until recently, the New South Wales Hate Crime Unit sat under counter-terrorism in New South Wales Police. But for trans people and LGBTIQ people broadly, families, parents and partners is where there is growing risk of prejudice-motivated violence. So without proper training and appreciation for the potential of that intersection between family violence and hate crime, we're unlikely to get a full profile of victimisation in Australia from any sources of investigation, and very unlikely for the community too to have confidence in their reports, confidence that their reports are being dealt with properly by police and being being channeled to the right places within police to be investigated. From a kind of a statistics perspective, one of the most pressing problems in estimating the extent of victimisation in trans and gender diverse community is that in Australia, we have no reliable estimates of how many trans and gender diverse people there are in Australia. In the 2016 census, recorded only 1,260 transgender people in the country, a figure that's pretty laughable to all of those in the community. Not only do we not know base level population data, but there's no official process of recording transgender and gender diverse statuses in official government reports. Often gender identity is not recorded as part of official inquiries themselves. So for example, I've investigated the Queensland Coroner's report of Mayang Presetio's murder. And in that coroner's report, it does not mention her transgender status at all. The only mention, or the only indication that one would have that she was potentially a transgender person is a one-line remark saying there's little known about domestic violence in the LGBTIQ community. We've got nationally very well established self-report victimisation surveys. So for example, the Australian Bureau of Statistics Personal Safety Survey, but the Personal Safety Survey only uses the binary categories male and female to record all victimisation data, of no ability to record gender, transgender or gender diverse status or experience, and certainly no ability to record it over a lifetime, which I'll come back to in a moment. So I guess the challenge for criminology is, if we don't know the nature and the extent of victimisation, how can we intervene with preventative initiatives or victim services or investigations? Having very little comprehensive data, what I've been trying to do is put together what we do know about Australia, which is mostly from public health surveys, and compare that to some international statistics and see how we're faring. One of the largest studies into homophobia and transphobia in Australia to date is the survey in Queensland, Speaking Out. One of the authors, Shirlene Robinson, I'm not sure if Shirlene's here. Hello if you are. This survey is now 10 years old. It was Queensland specific and it interviewed only a very small number of transgender people. However, it found almost ceiling level of experiences of verbal abuse over a lifetime by trans women. 92% of trans women reported that. It found about 65% of trans women and trans men had received threats of physical violence. It found 46% of trans women had experienced physical assault, and about 45% of both trans women and trans men had experienced sexual assault. And these are really extraordinarily high figures, far higher than general population. Another Australian survey around the same time, which interviewed trans men, also a very small number of trans men, did find really high rates of intimate partner violence in that particular survey. Upwards of 61% of trans men reported intimate partner violence. So although the numbers are small, they actually track pretty well with international findings of transgender and gender diverse people. There's some variations that could be explained by, for example, if a question was asked over a lifetime, or it was asked about your experience since a particular age, or if it was asked about a recent experience within the last 2 years, for example, or whether it was actually asking a question about transphobic violence, about family violence, or about victimisation broadly, and also whether participants themselves would draw those same kind of distinctions in answering those questions. So the good news is that in the past year or so, there's been some really great research that's come out of public health. Some people I'm sure are here today as part of the Kirby Institute and ACON, who were involved in the survey on the left here. So in the last year, there's been really significant improvements in data collection, and two of the largest studies so far on transgender people in Australia and New Zealand, which show that they experience sexual violence at really alarming rates. So the survey on the left, the 2018 Australian Trans and Gender Diverse Health Survey, had 1,613 participants and found really high rates of sexual victimisation. They found that more than half of trans and gender diverse people had experienced sexual violence or coercion in their lifetime. And so more than half is obviously far above the national levels of 1 in 5 women and 1 in 20 men reported in victimisation surveys. In that survey, sexual assault was far more common for people assigned female at birth, and that most of those people who were assaulted reported multiple instances of victimisation. And that's the same as well in some hate crime data that we know from overseas. However, the Kirby study was a sexual health study, not a dedicated victimisation study. So the questions around sexual violence was only some of very many questions asked in that paper, in that survey around sexual health. And because of this, it did not retrieve information on who the perpetrator of the sexual violence was, or the ages of people at which that victimisation occurred, or nor did it ask about other types of victimisation other than sexual violence. And I found this is really common across the literature, and something that I'm trying to get my head around when I'm grappling with how to interpret this. So gender people tend to be quite visible now in public health surveys, but those victimisation questions tend to be asked in the specific public health context of survey design. So it's rightly examining transgender people's, for example, intersecting vulnerabilities such as high suicide rates, medical needs, legal discrimination, lack of employment, financial hurdles, and familial and social rejection. So victimisation becomes just another risk factor in there. And what I would say is that's really great, and I'm very grateful for those people that have done that, but also we need a really targeted approach that looks at these issues from criminology perspective in order to better target services towards this community. So in criminology, I found that the survey results either aggregate transgender people along with all other LGBTIQ people, they leave out transgender people because they say their numbers are too small, or they simply just ignore their presence overall. And I would suggest that given the extraordinary levels of victimisation that we're beginning to see that have come out of public health surveys, we in criminology really need to very urgently know more about transgender victimisation and the potential implications for creating a primary prevention programs, for creating perpetrator interventions, for creating family violence initiatives, in tailoring policing responses, in tailoring health responses, legal and justice outcomes, and victim support services. In some of the comparisons that I've done between Australian rates and overseas rates in relation to transgender people and perpetrators, I've found that it seems that if we compare overseas perpetrator rates in relation to transgender people, that the profiles are pretty similar in terms of the general population in Australia and overseas transgender population, in that most perpetrators of sexual violence were acquaintances or others known to the victims, such as their family or other partners. Where I found that there was a big difference between the victimisation rates of transgender people and general Australian population is in physical assault. So I found that if we compared international rates of transgender people's physical assault, strangers appeared 2 or 2.5 times more in assaults against transgender people than they do against overall general population. So that tells me that there's a potential there for a lot of intervention in terms of policing resources, in terms of the organisational resourcing, and also the role of third-party reporting in terms of recording stranger assaults, particularly for physical violence. So when we can come up with what these real substantive differences are, we can start to tailor programs towards them. But if we don't know what they are, we can't. And so I've just at the bottom of this slide here highlighted a couple of other ways in which I've been thinking about how trans and gender diverse people might have different experiences of violence. So for example, how can gender identity function as part of sexual abuse? What I did here was I looked at the very small number of transgender survivors who testified to the Royal Commission into Institutional Child Sexual Abuse. And in those testimonies, most of the survivors explained that their gender identity had been part of the process of abuse as a child. It had related to various methods of humiliation or shaming, including religious interventions such as exorcism to rid them of their gender identity. And in many cases, gender identity was also conflated at the time as part of homosexuality. And we might also ask, how does sexual violence function, in particular trans and queer communities? Academic Jess Iverson, in a recent Me Too collection, talked about the potential for acquaintance density in queer communities. And I think this is something Sophie, who I think was there before as well, is looking at, so that perpetrators and survivors may well be in the same social groups all the time, which has a lot of implications for informal social control, informal policing of those communities. And so those are just some of the, and there's also the crossover between family violence and hate crime that I mentioned earlier. And those are just some of the examples that we could start to think about in terms of doing qualitative and quantitative research on the profile of victimisation in trans and gender diverse communities. And so what I'd say is that really this is what we need to do. And that while this work should be done in consultation with trans and gender diverse people, not all of it can be done just by them. And it should be incorporated into mainstream surveys. And I think it's pretty easy to actually do this, to incorporate it into mainstream victimisation surveys. There's been some really positive signs, particularly from the US, in terms of mainstream traction on these issues. So for example, in the US, last year, the American Medical Association followed the peak national body, the Human Rights Commission, in labelling anti-transgender violence an epidemic in the US and calling for proper classification and recording of hate crimes and gender identity across the country. So far, mainstream feminist and even queer criminology has really little engaged with the analysis or prevention of transgender people's victimisation. In a 2018 review of all publications in leading criminology journals, some American academics found that transgender people were grossly underrepresented in criminal justice research overall. Despite all this advocacy work and the evidence of high victimisation rates, they found, quote, shockingly few studies in the sample. Only 0.02% of studies in all mainstream criminology journals mentioned or even considered transgender people, and that when they did so, it was often as a limitation of the study. We did not consider transgender people, and so therefore it was a limitation of our study. So part of the answer to the title of this talk, which is where is criminology's research on transgender people, is that this absence is data and it's method driven. And because it's data and it's method driven, in that case, it's solvable. At present, most national and official data collects material in only male and female differentials, and it supposes that those stay the same and constant over one's lifetime, whereas we know that they possibly do not for trans and gender diverse people. Once we recognise that we need to count and classify gender diverse populations across a lifetime of experience as a whole person with a whole range of different experiences, this can then be incorporated into survey design. And just here by example, I'll use myself as a subjective example of how we could incorporate this into survey design. So I'm 38, I'm a member of LGBTIQ communities, and I've been a member of them for 20 years. Across that period of time, I have been surveyed a lot about my experiences, and across that period of time, I would have identified in any of those surveys as, firstly as a lesbian, then as a butch person, later as a queer person. I first identified as transgender in 2005. 10 years later, I legally changed my first name and I identified as genderqueer. Upon starting medical transition in 2018, I identify as transmasculine and non-binary. I've had long-term relationships with cis women, with non-binary partners assigned female at birth. Most people outside of the community often perceive me as a cis man and perceive me as also as heterosexual, I've found now. So my own personal identifications and how I might have reported in any survey across time cut across multiple categorizations within the LGBTIQ community, often at the same time, and they illustrate some of those methodological issues that we need to take into account in survey design. So depending on when you might have asked me in my life, I might be reporting to you an experience that often belies the statistical capture of binaries such as male, female, transgender or cisgender, homosexual or heterosexual, something that surveys often take as being standard across one's lifetime. And so that's kind of the summation of the issues around method and design and reporting. And now I'm turning to a kind of shorter section in the paper where I'm talking about where we're actually finding criminology research on transgender people. And so I would say it's quite worrying that outside of these kind of method questions and the questions around victimisation, where some of the latest research is coming out is actually in the issue of transgender prisoners and their housing in sex-segregated facilities. Now, as I said at the outset, the issue of sex-segregated prisons has become increasingly divisive in the UK. It's gained a lot of mainstream academic and press attention, and this dispute between trans rights activists, self-proclaimed gender-critical philosophers, most who come from British and Canadian feminist philosophy, and up until now, actually very few from criminology, with their claims increasingly circulated by Twitter and the British press, actually predominantly The Guardian in the British press. So they regularly comment on the status of transgender people in sex-segregated facilities, such as prison. And I think it's really important for us to look at these issues rather than ignore them, because they're now making their way into mainstream academic and peer-reviewed literature. So despite significant evidence that trans prisoners are at significant risk themselves of harm in prison, gender-critical philosophers focus on the harm, real or supposed, that trans prisoners do to cis women in prison. In the UK, the most prominent example, and this discourse really took off after this case, was the case of Karen Wright, who was a transgender woman with a history of serious sexual offending, who was placed in a women's prison. And it seems that she was placed in a women's prison as the result of a procedural error, this particular ward anyway, because it didn't take into account her offending history. And she then went on to commit sexual assaults against female prisoners. In response, some radical feminists have argued, firstly, that transgender women are sexually dangerous to cis women prisoners, that sex offenders are using a transgender status to access cis women, or that they're otherwise gaining advantage by using a transgender status. And broadly, they feel that what they call birth sex should be a protected characteristic under law. In March last year, London's Downview Prison opened a segregated ward for transgender women who were separated from cisgender women because of these safety issues. In December last year, December 2019, prominent criminology professor Jo Phoenix was due to speak at Essex University, but had her lecture cancelled because of accusations that her paper on trans prisoners was transphobic in content. Phoenix's cancellation came on the back of a number of other cancellations of gender critical feminists, and there's been a lot more since, prominent historians and philosophers. Phoenix claimed that she was not transphobic and had given the same paper in Canada, she said, but there was no issue there. She didn't release the Essex paper, but on Twitter, she directed people to this peer-reviewed co-authored paper published with 2 Canadian colleagues titled "It's Complicated," in which they interview prison officers about their views on transgender prisoners. So I don't have time to go into all aspects of the study, but I'll just focus on one common claim here made by gender critical philosophers and feminists, which is that sex segregated prisons create safe spaces for women prisoners. Relying in part on historical logic in this paper and in others in this discourse, historical logic of the notion of creating safety for cis women through a sex segregated system, the authors of this paper argue that meeting the needs of trans prisoners challenges those very histories, rationalities, and the continuing existence of sex segregated facilities in terms of their focus on safety and order. And so being a historian, I would approach this argument from a historical perspective, which is that from a historical perspective, this is not by any means the first time that sex segregated prisons have been challenged. In fact, the origins of sex segregated carceral facilities don't really have to do with women's safety. That wasn't the principle in mind in their creation. The main historian of 18th century US prisons, Jen Mannion, argues that the fact the creation of segregated facilities, their primary aim was actually to protect white men's potential virtue from being corrupted by women's pre-existing licentiousness. And what Jen Mannion means by that is that, in other words, women were actually perceived to be the bad influences in prison. And they were especially seen to be a bad sexual influence on men. And indeed, historically, mixed prisons were associated with sex work deemed at the time to be a source of moral and religious corruption for men. So safety was not actually the prime concern in creating some sex segregated facilities. Transgender prisoners are also not the first to pose a problem in sex segregated prisons. For the most of the 19th and the 20th century, it was homosexuals in male prisons, and to a lesser extent lesbians in female prisons, that were understood to pose safety risks, order risks, and issues that went to the heart of what they understood as sexual and gender ordering of society overall. Prison reformers were particularly worried about camp homosexual men, said to take on female characteristics and encourage sexual activity between men, and just as they were worried about butch women as potential aggressors in prison. As historian Estelle Friedman explains, the lesbian prisoner emerged as a trope in the mid-century, presenting a danger for the corruption of women in prison and the potential for prison violence. Similarly, Yorick Smile, don't know if Yorick's here, and I, in a genealogy of sexual violence in male prisons, showed that from the 1950s and the 1960s, homosexual men were considered to be the source of prison violence there, as homosexuality was considered to be a dangerous sexual problem that could be spread throughout the prison by homosexual men, causing disorder. Concerns were so much so, and you can see this is an Australian newspaper here from 1953, that in 1958 they created in New South Wales a segregated facility for homosexual men, a segregated homosexual-only prison in Cooma that ran from 1958 up until at least the early 1970s. So here we can see there are direct historical parallels in these contemporary debates about transgender prisoners to historical discussions about homosexuals in prisoners. They too were considered much the source of sexual violence. They too were argued that they needed to be segregated for the protection of other prisoners. Historical prison authorities also created a similar identity of the situational homosexual, which has a lot of parallels to this kind of new identity that some of these gender critical philosophers seem to be creating of the opportunistic transgender prisoner who elects to identify in that way to gain some kind of advantage in prison. But for criminology itself, it seems that these past views have been long forgotten. As in the 1970s, the ideas really shifted away from thinking about homosexual men as threats, as social threats, to homosexual men and to LGBTIQ people overall as victims of violence. In fact, the first discussions about the lack of safety of homosexual men in prison were amongst the first in society overall, thinking about the concept of male rape. And so there was a real shift from the earlier historical view, 50s, 60s and earlier, that saw homosexual people as potential offenders, to the more recent view of being victims of violence. And I think that this is a really important historical parallel that we should be highlighting in response to some of these arguments about segregation of transgender prisoners in these facilities. And my point here on the slide on the left, we've been here before with these arguments, particularly the point around safety in prisons. And these are, in fact, the exact same arguments that were made historically. And amongst the many other concerns that I have of these views is the current views, at least, is the scapegoating of trans women for wider cultures of rape in male and female prisons, just as we saw previously in relation to homosexual men and lesbian women. Numerous studies have shown the vulnerability of female prisoners to sexual assault, assaults by prison officers, assaults by other cisgender inmates. The removal of transgender women from prisons doesn't reconcile any of those long-term safety issues of the carceral state. It doesn't reconcile the potential for sexual victimisation by inmates or by guards. And it doesn't deal with the fact that prisons themselves are criminogenic institutions where violence, sexual or otherwise, are kindled by the very nature of their culture. And in fact, in some facilities, it is considered part of the punishment of prison that violence in prison exists. So I'm kind of done with my presentation now. I'll just sum up with a couple of concluding remarks and then come to Giselle for questions. If I can get out of this, it'd be good as well. So, broadly, what I've touched on is that transgender victimisation has been a neglected area of criminological research. Despite much research in related disciplines in public health, the extent of the victimisation of this small community with complex needs is still largely unknown. For research on transgender people to be really fulsome, it needs to tackle these issues in diversity that I've pointed to here through an awareness of historical, social, legal and classificatory circumstances that apply to members of this specific community. And if we're going to take really seriously levels of victimisation and create methods of primary prevention and intervention, I suggest we need to first capture the profile of these experiences in national surveys that include, in a fulsome way, transgender people with the general population. And also we need to take on and counter the increasingly popular views of gender critical feminists, which seem to have very little basis in evidence and a lot of potential for political scapegoating, as we have long seen in the case of sexual minorities. I think their views can't go unchallenged, and they certainly can't be the sole focus of mainstream criminology research on transgender people. Thank you.
Excellent. I'll clap on behalf of everyone else. Although I can see some clapping. That's great. If anyone has any questions, feel free to pose them in the comments. Or also happy to field questions from people if you'd like to turn your microphone on. Stephen, did you have, or Stefan, did you have a question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, hi, Stephen.
Can you hear me? Hi, Andy. Thanks for that. Oh, look, it's the only question I can dream up in a hurry is just to, I already mentioned in that message. Les Moran and Alex Sharp did research that you've seen it. It was a small study, early 2000s.
It's a very small study.
And Alex at that time still identified as a man. This was before transitioning. He was a senior lecturer at Macquarie and then got that chair in the UK later on. So, I mean, that doesn't contradict what you're saying about criminology, though. They're two law academics. So,
yeah, and I think, Alex's research has been really important, and it is mostly in law and mostly in the courts. And what I think it's super important research that she's doing. What I worry about that is that so few people are actually going through the court system, in that way, that kind of legal doctrinal research is quite limited in its actual effect on thinking about how the criminal justice system broadly is interacting with transgender people.
Yeah.
Okay, we might just move on to, sorry.
You're right, yeah.
On to a question from Kate Davison. Kate, are you there? Would you like to pose your question? I'll just read that question from Kate. So Kate said, the Canadian study and the position it represents seems to be shockingly lacking in terms of intersectional perspectives on violence, as though if men are absent, violence is absent.
Yeah, and that is certainly in that study, they're using the interviews with correctional officer recruits to kind of make that point. So the correctional officer recruits don't mention other types of safety concerns or sexual violence concerns in women's prisons. So therefore it's not fully discussed in the article. I mean, I think that is relatively problematic in a number of different ways, the design of the study. But in the views of the correctional officers, that was certainly their position. For example, one of them saying, well, if trans women were further along in their transition, then it might be okay for them to be in women's prisons, but before they've had surgery, therefore it's not. So it's like a really kind of obsession on the body itself and on anatomy, on genitals, etc., and thinking about that as linking it to violence. I mean, I find it very problematic overall from a feminist perspective, from an intersectional perspective, from just a data perspective as well.
Great. We'll just move to a question from Bianca and then to Nicole. So Bianca, would you like to pose a question?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. And thanks, Andy, for that presentation. That was, really thought-provoking and disturbing and concerning all at the same time. I'm going to be really cheeky and ask two questions, actually. So the first one, I guess, is a general question around methodology in criminology. And it really seems to me, and sorry, Nicole, I saw you've asked a methodology question as well, so I don't know if I'm about to pitch your question. But it really seems to me that mainstream criminology is still very much caught up in a very positivist approach where, you know, I've certainly had experiences where I've submitted work for publication or for review where we've been told to leave out trans and gender diverse people because the sample wasn't, you know, quote unquote big enough. So
Yeah.
I guess my first question is how, you know, what are some strategies we might be able to use to overcome this kind of methodological emphases in criminology. And then the second question is around gender critical feminists, and I guess kind of a similar question. So we've certainly had challenges at Melbourne Uni. We've got some very high profile gender critical people, and we've certainly found it incredibly difficult to successfully challenge some of the things that these people are saying because there is a veneer of you know, reasonable academic debate. So I guess I'd also be curious to hear your thoughts about how we might effectively work to challenge you know, the things that gender critical people are saying.
Yeah, sure. So on the first question, I mean, I think that there's the need for both quantitative and qualitative research, and it's in qualitative research that we'll start to find out some of the answers to those questions of the particular, I guess, nature of victimisation of transgender people. And I think that can really only be done through, like Nicole's asked a question about life course, so through life course interviews. And we already interview people in this way about changes over their lifetime for numerous other different types of health factors or other social factors. So I think, you know, for some kind of mainstream criminologists, it's just simply, and I'm not at all putting us in this boat, but simply recognising that gender is something that can change over a lifetime and needs to be accounted for in various ways, you know, in the study, and it can just simply be captured within the survey design. Like, I don't see it as an insurmountable problem. It's just that up until thus far, that has been seen as like a fixed variable, but actually it's not. In terms of the limitations of small samples, I say we join with public health researchers like those other people that are here at the moment, who are already capturing far bigger samples than we are, and try to tailor some of those questions there. Try to tailor some of the design of those questions for those larger studies. Did that answer your question, Bianca? Perhaps Nicole's question as well. I mean, I think that, yeah, in terms of developmental and life course study, we're already doing that. In terms of interacting with gender critical feminists, I've spent about the last year trying to read as much as I can writing from gender critical feminists, and I find that it's mostly very lacking in evidence, that like in actual, like, you know, in actual stats. And it's a lot of it is discourse and conjecture and ideology and, you know, kind of like logic puzzles put together. And so I think, like, from my perspective, actually asking, well, what are the concerns? Who are these people? How does it work? So, like, taking them on our terms, the terms of what the substantial evidence that they're actually talking about, because I think that's in that it really their views really crumble very quickly. And I know, like, Bianca, actually in one of your conversation articles was really good at doing that. The article about asking, you know, are transgender people offenders in terms of sexual violence? Are they likely to offend? And which you say, you know, in that conversation article, actually they're far more likely to be victims than not.
Great. Let's go to a question from Sophie. Sophie, would you like to ask your question?
Sure thing. Thanks, Andy. That was really great. I really enjoyed that presentation. Such important things to be talking about. My question is, do you think feminist researchers in defining sexual violence, you know, over the last 40 years as largely a problem of men's violence over women, has inadvertently done a disservice to the LGBTIQ+ community? And how do you think that we can hold this important research that's been done about sexual violence as being this problem of men's power over women, but as well as incorporating the experiences and nuances of the LGBTIQ+ community at the same time?
Yeah, and I think that's where we can really learn from the discussions that happened around male rape. And a lot of those discussions about male rape actually came out of the LGBTIQ community, saying we have similar experiences in our community. This isn't just a women's problem. And I think, but why can't we do both? Why can't we define, sexual violence as a problem of masculinity, as a problem of cis men, predominantly? Why don't we name it as what it is? And then, in doing that, we take the power away from those arguments. And I think that there's actually a bit of a problem in some of the way that feminist philosophers talk about sexual violence, in that I agree, they do define it in a way of men's violence over women, but they also define it as an issue of power. So if we're thinking about those related feminist concerns about issues of power and coercion, it also takes the focus away from particular people's bodies at being the source of violence. Does that answer your question, Sophie?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks so much. Great answer.
Let's go to a question from AB. AB, can you read your question, please?
Yes, thank you so much. Hi, my name is Netta, and I'm zooming in from the University of Southern Queensland, and I'm leading a research project exploring the lived experiences of trans folks in Queensland. And I really appreciate you lifting up some of those concerns around safety, health and well-being, thinking about the rights, human rights violations. And I guess having battled with, for lack of a better word, navigating the landmines of seeking, so methodologically, to even get access